Good evening. Thanks for joining me tonight. I'm your narrator. I'm not an AI voice. I'm an actual human reading words to you until you fall asleep. But before you drift off, make sure you hit that subscribe button and keep coming back for more sleepy stories. Tonight's story is about man landing on the moon, the Apollo missions, the space race, as told by a young man from Huntsville, Alabama named William, who watched it all happen on his television. I remember the heat that day. Sticky, deep south summer heat. The kind that clung to your skin like a wet towel. The kind that makes the air feel thick, almost like syrup, and even the cicadas seemed too tired to scream. But even the heat couldn't distract me from what was happening. Not tonight. This was the night we were going to land on the moon. Mom had moved the old Zenith television into the living room so we could all sit together. It had a thick glass screen and wood frame, smelled like old varnish and dust. The black and white picture was fuzzy, but it didn't matter. I was about to watch history happen. Right there, in my own living room, in Huntsville, Alabama. "William, you done with your reading?" Dad called from the kitchen, his voice cutting through the hum of the box fan. "Yeah, just finished," I lied. Truth was, I had the book still open in my lap. Man and the Moon, The Road to Apollo. We'd been reading about the space race in school, but I couldn't stop after the bell rang. I wanted to know every last detail. Warner von Braun's rocket designs. How the Saturn V was built right here in Huntsville. The Mercury missions. The Gemini test. Every blown gasket and every miracle save. I felt like I was watching my hometown's fingerprints stretch all the way to the moon. Dad came in carrying a bowl of popcorn, wearing his usual plaid shirt and work-stained jeans. His job at Redstone Arsenal meant he was connected to all of this in a way that made my chest buzz. He wasn't allowed to say much about what he did, but I knew enough that his hands had helped build the rockets that got us right here. That alone made me sit up straighter. "Think they'll make it?" I asked him, trying not to sound like a kid, but also not pretending I wasn't worried. Dad looked at me for a second, then sat down in his recliner. "If they don't, son, it won't be for lack of brains or grit. Those boys up there, they've got the best minds in the world behind them." Those boys, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. I knew their names like I knew the names of baseball players or comic book heroes. But they weren't fiction, they were real. They were floating in the blackness, 240,000 miles from my house. I looked at the clock, 3:55 p.m. Central Time. The Eagle should be making its descent any minute now. The television picture blinked and buzzed before setting into a gray image of mission control. I recognized the big map with the spacecraft's position tracked across it in a jagged arc. A man's voice crackled through the speakers, calm, clipped, focus. "Eagle, Houston, your go for power descent." I swallowed hard. My palms were sweaty. I gripped the arm of the couch as if it would steady the spacecraft somehow. Mom came in and sat beside me, wiping her hands on her apron. She'd been cooking Sunday supper, pot roast and cornbread. But even she couldn't keep her attention away from the screen. "What if something goes wrong?" she whispered. Dad didn't answer right away. He leaned forward, eyes locked on the screen like he was trying to wheel the lander down safely with the force of his stare. "They're trained for every situation," he said eventually. "They've practiced this 1,000 times. "But they've never done it," I said, almost too quietly to hear. The next few minutes were the longest of my life. Armstrong's voice came through reporting altitudes, confirming the computer was guiding them towards the surface. I remembered reading that he'd flown the lunar landing simulator hundreds of times, that he once ejected just seconds before it crashed. Then the tone in his voice changed. There was a pause. He was taking manual control. I felt my stomach drop like I was falling with him. "They're running low on fuel," Dad said. His voice was low. He didn't want to say it out loud. "He's looking for a safe place to set down. Too many rocks. They have to land in 30 seconds or they're aborting," I added, remembering that detail from my book. I hadn't meant to say it, but the words tumbled out. I looked at Mom. Her hands were clasped together like she was praying. Then Armstrong's voice again, steady as stone. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." I swear the whole world held its breath for a beat. The cheers erupted for mission control. On TV, the men in the room jumped to their feet, clapping and shouting, hugging each other like they'd just won a war. In our living room, I shouted so loud my dog barked from under the table. Dad gave a little cheer, a rare crack in his usual calm. Mom's eyes welled with tears as she reached for my hand. "They did it," I said, not believing it myself. They really did it. The hours that followed felt like a dream. We waited for the astronauts to suit up, to get ready for the moonwalk. Outside, the sun was beginning to set over the Tennessee River, but inside our house, it was still daytime, moontime. I kept flipping through my book, looking at diagrams of the lunar modules, trying to match what I saw on TV with the technical sketches I'd memorized. I imagined myself inside the cramped metal can, staring out at the gray dust of the moon, feeling the gravity loosen its grip on me. And then the moment came. The screen cut to a grainy, ghost-like image. The ladder of the lunar module appeared, stark against the flat gray of the moon's surface. Static hissed like wind through the speakers. And there he was, a single boot stepping carefully down the ladder. Neil Armstrong, a man from Earth, on the moon. "That's one small step for man," his voice said. "One giant leap for mankind." I didn't breathe, not really. Not until Aldrin followed him, and two men bounced across the surface, planting a flag, running experiments, picking up moon rocks. I leaned forward until my nose almost touched the screen. My mind raced, not just with the moment, but with everything that had led to it. I thought of Yuri Gagarin and John Glenn, of JFK's speech, the one our history teacher played for us on a record. We chose to go to the moon. I thought of the rockets that had thundered out of Huntsville and Cape Kennedy, of the engineers and mathematicians, many of whom lived just down the road from me. I wondered if I'd seen any of them at church or at the grocery store. Maybe I'd seen someone who built the very part Armstrong was standing on. The moon was 240,000 miles away, but tonight it felt like it was right outside my window. I stayed up as long as I could, watching the feed, scribbling notes in my school notebook. My eyes were red and burning, but I didn't care. I didn't want to forget a single second. I knew that tomorrow the world would be different. My generation had done something no one else had. We looked up at the sky and said, "We're going." The screen went to static sometime after midnight. I must have drifted off the couch, head against a throw pillow, the book still open in my lap. I woke up to the low hum of the test pattern and the flickering glow of the TV, like a ghost trying to talk. Mom had gone to bed. Dad had covered me with the Afghan blanket from the back of the couch and turned out most of the lights. I could hear the tick of the wall clock, the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, and something outside, a dog barking maybe, or the wind in the pines. My eyes drifted to the moon outside the window, still up there, glowing like a silver coin. But now it felt different. Before it was just a light in the sky, something pretty, but tonight it was a place, a real place. People had worked on it, left footprints. And suddenly my mind started replaying everything that led to this night. Not just the day's events, but all the ones that came before. I was only a baby when Sputnik launched in 1957, but I'd seen the old newspapers my grandpa kept in the attic. He'd shown them to me once, proud of the way America had responded to the challenge. He always called that time when we got our fire lit. I remember sitting on the rug in our classroom in 3rd grade watching old newsreels of Alan Shepard's flight in Freedom 7. Our teacher, Mrs. Garland, had brought in a reel-to-reel projector for Space Week. I didn't understand most of it then, but I remember the roar of the rocket, the sight of Shepard bobbing in the ocean afterward, looking like a space hero and a soaked sailor all at once. And then came John Glenn. He was the one that really stuck with me. I must have been about 8 or 9. And by then I was already obsessed with airplanes and flight. I built model rockets with glue-stuck fingers and lined my shelves with balsa wood airplanes that never quite flew straight. When Glenn orbited the Earth in Friendship 7, I remember sitting cross-legged on the carpet while the teacher read the news out loud to us. 3 times around the whole planet. I tried to imagine what it would feel like to see Earth from that far up, to see the curve of it, like in the drawings in our science textbook. It made me dizzy just thinking about it. But it wasn't all glory and celebration. I remember the grim silence when the news broke about the Apollo 1 fire. It was January, cold and gray. Our principal came over the loudspeaker that morning with a special announcement. Gus Grissom, Ed White, Roger Chafee. Their names echoed through the hallways. Kids didn't talk much at lunch that day. I remember poking at my sandwich, not even hungry. It hit me in a way I didn't expect. Those astronauts weren't comic book heroes anymore. They were real people. They had families, homes, favorite songs, dogs, favorite foods. And just like that, they were gone. Apollo 1 was supposed to be the first manned flight of the Apollo program. Just a simple test in Earth orbit. The mission had a name at first, AS-204, for Apollo Saturn 204, the flight designation. But the crew, Virgil Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chafee, called it Apollo 1. NASA made it official after the tragedy. January 27th, 1967. The crew was doing a plugs-out test on the launch pad at Cape Kennedy, meaning they were inside the command module running a full systems check without external power. Everything was supposed to be sealed up tight, just like it would be on launch day, but something happened. No one knows exactly what sparked the fire, maybe a frayed wire, maybe a short circuit, but what we do know is that the cabin was filled with pure oxygen at a higher than normal pressure. That made everything inside flammable. Velcro, nylon, even the astronaut suits. When the fire started, it spread fast, blazing through the cockpit in just seconds. The men didn't stand a chance. They were trapped inside. The hatch was complicated and couldn't be opened quickly. Ground crews tried desperately to get to them, but by the time they did, it was too late. 3 good men, gone before the rocket ever left the pad. I remember sitting outside of class that day in silence. I couldn't stop thinking about Ed White. He was the first American to walk in space during Gemini 4. Gus Grissom had flown Mercury and Gemini flights. Roger Chafee was about to fly his very first mission. They were heroes, and they died during a test. NASA changed after that, not just the spacecraft, but the culture. They rebuilt the command module from inside out, replacing flammable materials, redesigning the hatch so it could open in 5 seconds instead of 90, making everything safer. Every wire, every line of code, every checklist went through a microscope. People say Apollo 11 was the moonshot, but in a way, Apollo 1 saved the program. Because from that tragedy came hard-earned wisdom and a promise. Never again. Not if we can help it. Dad didn't talk much about Apollo 1. But the night it happened, at dinner, he said something I'll never forget. Courage isn't just climbing into a rocket, Will. It's knowing the risk and climbing in anyway. Over the years, the missions came faster. Gemini 6 and 7 rendezvousing in orbit. Gemini 8 with Armstrong again when the capsule started spinning uncontrollably and he had to take manual control. I read everything I could about that one. I still don't understand how he stayed calm enough to get out of that spin. And then came the big ones. Apollo 7, the first successful crewed Apollo flight. Apollo 8, the one that really left a mark on me. It was Christmas time, 1968. Everything felt a little broken that year. Vietnam was raging. There were protests and riots. Bobby Kennedy and Dr. King had both been killed. But then Apollo 8 happened. I remember sitting with my mom and dad watching the astronauts read from Genesis as they orbited the moon on Christmas Eve. The camera showed Earth hanging in the blackness, a bright blue marble floating in nothing. That image, it felt like medicine for a country that had forgotten how to breathe. It was the first time I really understood how small we all are and how connected. By spring of 1969, our science teacher had a calendar on the wall labeled Countdown to the Moon. Every week we added updates. I took it more seriously than my homework. Dad started bringing home little stories from work. Never classified stuff, of course, but little things. Who got promoted? Who was heading to Florida for the final test? Who was in charge of what stage of the rocket? He never said it outright, but I knew he felt proud we were part of this. Huntsville was part of this. I turned off the television and sat in the dark. The moonlight spilled through the window and stretched across the rug like silver paint. The house was quiet. Everyone was asleep, but my mind was awake, reliving everything that had led up to a man landing on the moon. I thought of the engineers at Marshall Space Flight Center who had spent years crunching numbers, building fuel tanks, testing engines. I thought of the welders and machinists and flight surgeons and mission planners. I thought of the African American women at NASA, Katherine Johnson, Mary Jackson, Dorothy Vaughan, whose math helped send men into orbit. They weren't in my school books yet, but I'd read about them in a magazine at the library. It made me angry that more people didn't know their names. I thought of the astronauts, of the wives who waited, of the families who held their breath every time a countdown began. And I thought about the kids like me, glued to televisions across the country, watching and wondering what might be next. Maybe one day it wouldn't be Armstrong or Aldrin. Maybe one day it would be a kid from my school. I picked up my notebook and flipped to a fresh page. I started scribbling down everything I remembered, every moment, every feeling. Not just what I saw on TV, but what it meant. Someday I want to read this again. Someday I want to show it to someone, my kids maybe, or my grandkids. Tell them I watched it happen, that I saw the first footprints land in lunar dust, that I lived in the town where rockets were born. When I woke up the next morning, the house was bright and full of the smell of breakfast. Dad was already gone. He left early as usual, but Mom had the radio on low and a pan of biscuits in the oven. I sat down, still rubbing sleep from my eyes as the announcer's voice came through the static. Celebrations from Paris to Pittsburgh. Ticker tape parades planned for the astronauts upon return. Even without opening my eyes, I could tell the world was different. It wasn't just the moonwalk. It was how it made people feel. Something had shifted. We weren't just living in the future anymore. We had become the future. When I rode my bike into town later that morning, I passed neighbors waving flags from their porches. At the Rexall drugstore, there were newspaper headlines plastered across the windows. The Eagle has landed, and men walk on the moon. All in bold black print that practically shouted off the page. Inside, people were buzzing like it was the 4th of July. Old Mr. Laney, who normally complained about the price of stamps and teenagers' long hair, was handing out little American flag pins from behind the counter. "Never thought I'd see the day," he said, shaking his head and smiling, like he'd just won the lottery. "Makes an old man proud." It wasn't just Huntsville either. TV coverage showed crowds dancing in the streets in New York and cheering outside the BBC in London. The Pope blessed the astronauts. Even countries that didn't always get along with us sent congratulations. For one shining moment, it felt like everyone had paused to look up at the same moon and say, "We did it." But here in Rocket City, it hit different. We weren't just watching history. We built it. That week at school, our teachers scrapped the usual lessons. Mrs. Garland brought in a stack of newspapers for us to cut out headlines and pictures. Mr. Will showed us a film about the Apollo mission he'd gotten from Redstone, and it was brand new. And when he asked the class how many of us had parents or relatives who worked at NASA, almost every hand shot up. We were part of it. I remember feeling the stir in my chest, a mix of pride and purpose, like maybe the moon wasn't the end of the story. Maybe it was just the beginning. Of course, the world kept turning. A few months later, Apollo 12 launched. I watched it on TV again, this time with a few friends from school. Pete Conrad and Alan Bean, less famous names than Armstrong and Aldrin, but no less brave, landed in the ocean of storms and brought back even more moon rocks than Apollo 11. Then came Apollo 13. That one hit different. We were in science class when the news broke. A problem in space, an explosion, oxygen leaking. I remember the tight knot in my stomach as we listened to the radio updates. For 3 days, it felt like the whole country held its breath. Once again, me and my mom and dad would gather around the television. It was grainy as always, but I was barely aware of the picture. My eyes were fixed, but my ears did all the work, listening for every clipped word from Mission Control, every tense update. Dad sat stiffly in his chair, arms crossed, staring like he could force the spacecraft back to Earth just by looking hard enough. Mom had her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she wasn't drinking. "Houston, we have a problem." At first, nobody really knew what had happened. Apollo 13 had launched like any other mission. I remember watching the Saturn V rise on April 11th, smooth and steady, and thinking how routine spaceflight was starting to feel. We'd already landed on the moon, twice. There was talk of building permanent stations, using moon rocks for science no one outside of NASA even understood yet. People were getting used to it. Maybe too used to it. Then came that explosion. An oxygen tank ruptured in the service module, crippling the spacecraft. Just like that, The mission went from exploration to survival. I remember the moment they showed the damaged craft on TV. Just an artist rendering at first, but the idea was terrifying. They said there was barely enough power. They said the carbon dioxide was building. And they said they weren't sure the heat shield would hold. Mom kept asking Dad what was going to happen, but even he, who always had an answer for everything, just said, "I don't know." That scared me more than anything. Because my dad worked with rockets, he spent years at Redstone Arsenal helping test the same engines that powered the Apollo missions. If he didn't know, that meant no one did. For days, we watched just like everyone. The networks dropped regular programming. Radio stations gave updates by the hour. In Huntsville, it was like the entire city stopped breathing. I saw a different side of people during those days. Folks who didn't care much about space suddenly prayed for astronauts by name. People who'd complained about the cost of rockets now stood in church halls, lighting candles. In our school, our principal held a moment of silence. The teacher let us listen to live coverage on a crackling AM radio in the corner of the classroom. It felt like Apollo 1 all over again, but this time we still had a chance to bring them home. I couldn't sleep the night before re-entry. The news said it was a coin toss. Maybe the heat shield was damaged. Maybe the angle was wrong. Maybe they'd burn up or skip off the atmosphere like a stone over water. I laid awake thinking about it. I pictured Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes cramped in a freezing lunar module, still joking through chattering teeth, still working problems like they had something left to prove. Dad sat up with me. He brought out his old flight manuals and talked through physics, showed me how they used the moon's gravity for a slingshot, how they powered down the ship to save the little battery they had. He said, "If they pull this off, it will be a bigger feat than the landing on the moon." And I believed him. We gathered in front of the TV. This time there was no camera footage, just the voice of mission control and a computer graphic of the capsule's path. I clenched my fist. Mom whispered a prayer. Dad leaned forward, elbows on knees. Then came the blackout, the 4 minutes of radio silence during re-entry. Longest 4 minutes of my life. No one breathed. The room was so quiet, I could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, the tick of the mantel clock, the faint chirp of birds outside starting in the morning song. Then, "Odyssey, Houston, do you read?" A pause, then a crackling voice. "Houston, this is Odyssey. It's good to see you again." The room erupted, not just ours, the whole country. Mission Control was cheering. I heard someone shouting outside. Mom cried and hugged me so tightly I couldn't breathe. Dad wiped his eyes and blamed the light. I just sat there, overwhelmed, trying to understand how close we'd come to losing them, and how somehow they made it home. That night, after everything calmed down, I wrote a note to myself in the back of my school notebook. Space will never be routine, not ever, but it will always be worth it. Because Apollo 13 reminded us that bravery isn't just taking the first step on a distant world. It's staying calm when everything goes wrong. It's turning failure into triumph. It's teamwork and brains and heart, all pushing in the same direction. The crew of Apollo 13 didn't land on the moon, but they taught us how to bring each other home. Apollo 14 got us back on track. Shepard and Mitchell brought a little swagger back to the mission. Shepard even hit a golf ball on the moon, which the papers ate up. People loved that story. It made the astronauts seem more human, like they were explorers. Sure, but still guys you could talk to over coffee. Apollo 15 and 16 brought the lunar rovers, actual cars on the moon. I couldn't believe it. The first time I saw them driving across the alien terrain like it was Sunday in the driveway. My dad joked that maybe next time they'll install a radio. And then came Apollo 17, the last one. I didn't believe it at first. We'd gone from barely being able to orbit the Earth to walking on the moon 6 times. And suddenly it was over. No more Saturn V launches. No more moonwalks. No more live TV broadcasts of boot prints and dust and astronauts bouncing like kangaroos in low gravity. Just silence. The end of something. I remember sitting back one night, not long after the final Apollo mission. It was chilly. I had my notebook, my flashlight, and a sweater I'd stolen from Dad. The stars looked different somehow. Still beautiful, but lonelier. I wondered what would come next. Maybe Mars, maybe space stations or colonies. But I also wondered if people would forget. Would they forget the flame of the rocket, the voice crackling from the moon, the way we all stopped to watch? Would it just become another chapter in a textbook? I hope not. Because even if the rockets were grounded for now, the dream didn't have to be. The moon landing didn't just change how we saw the sky, it changed how we saw each other. For one night in July 1969, the divisions between us didn't seem so sharp. The problems of Earth, war, politics, poverty, hate, they were still there, but they felt smaller. Because we'd proven we could do something bigger. We could look at the moon and say, let's go. And then we did. And I was there. I saw it happen. Life went on. I graduated school. I went to college. I ended up staying near Huntsville and eventually had my own family. Sitting on that couch that was different. The television was bigger, color now, with a clunky remote that never seemed to work right. But I still had that feeling in my chest, that same quiet tension, that breathless hope that hadn't changed. Is it going to be loud? My son Jamie asked. He was 7, the same age I'd been when I built my first model rocket. He sat cross-legged on the floor in his NASA t-shirt, eyes wide, hands full of popcorn he hadn't touched since the countdown started. Pretty loud, I said, smiling, but not in here. This is just the feed from the Cape. You'll hear it through the speakers. Jamie glanced back at me. They're going all the way into space? I nodded. Yep, first time in history a spacecraft goes up and comes back down to be used again. Like an airplane that you can fly into orbit. He turned back towards the screen. That's awesome. It was. On the screen, the countdown rolled down to 0. The white shuttle Columbia, strapped to its external tank and solid rocket boosters, stood gleaming against the blue Florida sky. And I was back there again, 12 years ago, sitting on a different couch, watching grainy black and white footage of the Eagle landing on the moon. So much had changed since then, and yet not really. When the shuttle engines came to life, I felt a jolt go through me, not just from the sound, though the thunder never failed to raise the hair on my arms, but from what it meant. We were flying again. And this time we were building something that could stay. Liftoff of the Space Shuttle Columbia on her maiden voyage, the announcer said, his voice rising over the sound of the boosters. A new era of space transportation has begun. I watched Jamie's reflection flicker in the TV screen as the shuttle climbed into the sky. And I thought about how far we'd come. Back in '69, everything had felt uncertain. We were building from scratch, every switch, every bolt, every scrap of knowledge, but it worked. And once the Saturn V flew, it changed everything. People like to say the moon landing was about the flag, about beating the Soviets, but that wasn't what stuck with me. It was the idea that we could do it all, that we could solve impossible problems, that we could put aside politics and fear and ego at least long enough to shoot for something bigger. The technology that came out of the Apollo didn't just stay in museums. It started showing up in hospitals, CAT scans, heart monitors, clean room techniques, fireproof materials, scratch-resistant lenses. Computer chips that once guided lunar modules now lived in microwaves and calculators in cars. Even the memory foam of Jamie's bed, developed by NASA. Space changed Earth too. But it wasn't just about tech. It was about imagination. People had looked up at the moon for millennia, written poems about it, prayed to it, dreamed under it, and then one day, we stepped on it. That moment redefined what was possible. Kids like me, kids in little towns, kids in cities, kids around the world, we saw that and thought, why not me? Why not more? Columbia arced high into the atmosphere. The boosters separated and fell. The shuttle kept climbing. Jamie turned around and grinned. Do you think I could go to space one day? I looked at him for a second, the curious little boy with popcorn in his lap and stars in his eyes, and I smiled. I don't see why not. Because that was the point, wasn't it? It wasn't about the moon or Mars or orbiting labs. It was about believing in what comes next. Later that night, after Jamie had gone to bed, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee. The sky was clear. The moon was high. I thought about my dad, how we sat on a couch just like this one, in July of 1969, watching Armstrong step into history. He's been gone a few years now, but sometimes I still hear his voice in my head. If they don't make it, it won't be for lack of brains or grit. He was right. Brains and grit got us to the moon, but belief and heart, that's what keeps us going back. The shuttle would fly again and again and again, and someday we'd go farther. Not just to visit, but to stay. And when we do, maybe Jamie will be there. Maybe his kids will be. And they'll look back at this little blue planet, just like Apollo 8 did, and realize how rare and beautiful it is. And they'll know we were the ones who took the first step. Thanks for joining me for tonight's story. I'm your narrator. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the page. And until next time, sleep tight.